Black revolutionaries, distillery owners, Italian fashion retailers, and Motown Grammy winners all share their best stories never before told in any other media outlets on Detroit is Different. Visit DetroitisDifferent.com or download the Detroit is Different app on Apple's App Store or Google's Play Store.
Welcome back to Detroit is Different, the podcast studios in full effect on a rainy day, but definitely we about to shower you with some information and some game and some artistry. Somebody that's definitely been here through the network, definitely connecting with Piper, but this man is art. This guy is activism. He is gardening, urban farming, and so much more. Also now, what I found out just on board into this, he knows a little bit of game about what's happening internationally. So like taking that local to regional to statewide to national to international and understanding how it all connects is something I nerd out on. So you guys gonna get something special for Detroit is Different. Not just this episode, but more than likely even sooner. Antonio Rafael, how you doing today?
I'm smooth, man. I'm chilling.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. All right.
We parsed the way through Ramadan.
Mm-hmm.
I've been enjoying the fast. It's a discipline, man. It's really,
yeah, it definitely is that.
As an artist, as a creative, discipline is something I struggle with. Just being real, like that's one of the reasons I participate in Ramadan as a non-Muslim person. It's an opportunity to exercise those muscles that I need to be, flexing more and more.
I lasted a week a couple years back, sun up to sundown in 2015, when I was like getting in focus for my album and everything. It's hard to believe, like, damn, 2015 it seemed like yesterday, but from some people, Ahmad, shout out to Ahmad, and others that I know that tell me a little bit more about the faith and the practice, fasting. Also, as we know, fasting is not just something exclusive to Islam, depending upon how you practice your Christianity, Judaism, Hinduism, like it goes across the board. And like you say, in discipline and so much, it taps into something. Because a lot of it, you find out is mental. You sitting around thinking like, man, I want some Doritos. It's 11 o'clock. And it's like, no, you don't need those Doritos. Your mind's telling you need those Doritos.
You just walk around and see, food. Like your eyes just pan to food. You realize how much that stomach brain, influences the way you move through the world. I like that you said that, the stomach brain.
It's going to be some trainer that's going to take that and they're going to be like on Instagram somewhere. So, hey, just know that this man deserves some name, image, and likeness connected to that before somebody hops up in your timeline like, hey, is your stomach brain controlling you?
So as I learned more recently, as a baby is growing, the brain and the stomach are like connected. So then they separate up. And then the spinal column forms and all that neural connectivity.
And that kind of would make sense because you think about eating when you were a kid. That's like...
So yeah. Yeah, that's why so much emotions are in the gut or in the stomach, as you feel things out. Like a lot of the fear centers, you get the fight or flight happens a lot in the stomach too. And so much of the body preparing for those sorts of fight or flight happens with the digestive system too. All right. It's all connected.
Yes, and you guys already can tell just from this start of a discussion, this is going to be a classic discussion for Cardi. So let's take you down the classic road. Detroit. How did your family get about to Detroit? What's the backstory of Antonio, your fam, in the city?
Yeah, so my grandfather on my Puerto Rican side was a sugarcane sharecropper in Puerto Rico.
Wow.
So
whereabouts in Puerto Rico?
So he's from Sabana Grande. And my grandmother's from Añasco. And Añasco is like the country. It's like it's a hilly side on the west side of Puerto Rico. And Sabana Grande is like a valley. And my grandma, she had a small farm. Her father had a small farm, and my grandpa worked as a sharecropper. So my grandpa was born in 1936, I want to say. My sister would give me the right exact date, but it was like in late 30s. And that was only 30 years into the U.S. taking of Puerto Rico from Spain. So when the U.S. took Puerto Rico from Spain, they consolidated the land into fewer and fewer sugarcane families. So my grandpa was a sharecropper on a sugarcane sort of community. He left there when he was young. He wanted to escape that sort of, damn near slavery servitude sort of life.
So let me explain to people what that kind of is. So like a lot of times we get confused, and sharecropping was obviously a practice here in the States as well, with many of the black descendants of enslavement. So after, quote unquote, we were free, you were offered sharecropping opportunities. So to share in the crop, which is really game for, in a lot of ways, at times, worse conditions than being enslaved. Because now it's like you work off your share of what you control for your crop. Meaning like, it'd be like if, what's a good example? It'd be like if you worked at, for lack of a better term, if you needed to eat and McDonald's said like, guess what? You can share eat, meaning like if you produce this much productivity based on what we judge, then you can eat this many Big Macs or fries or whatever.
It'd be like if your whole family lived and worked at McDonald's.
And then
the McDonald's owned the grocery store you bought from, and McDonald's rented you the house that used that. So like they control your home, the local stores, your probably even the church, all that was centralized through the landowner. So
what made this so problematic is the same way in colonies in territories that were colonized as here in the American South, why many people wanted to leave the American South, was these were obviously the people that owned the plantations before. So it's not like they were very fair with you. It's like, 2 weeks ago, you were our property. Now we're saying you kind of got to share. So basically they say, you come with your bundles of like tomatoes or whatever. And it's like, all right, you said 100 tomatoes and then my family gets to eat and then we get to sell. I got your 100 tomatoes and now these other 100 I can sell to the town or whatever. But it doesn't work like that. They're like, bad tomato, bad tomato, bad tomato, bad tomato, bad tomato. And you're like, damn, I just worked this hard and all I get is this little bit of peace. But I just wanted to give that context so people have a better understanding that some of this visceral response that many of our descendants have, even in the urban farming, urban gardening movement, go back to like the departure from agriculture from people that have been connected and rooted in agriculture for so long, is just the way that agriculture has been weaponized against our people through the commoditization and the capitalization of agriculture through like enslavement, sharecropping, and so many other things. Hence why certain people say, I ain't doing no farming, I ain't doing no this, because that kind of has been passed down from generation to generation to generation to generation.
Negative
due to those
perceptions
traumatic,
that come from that. Exactly. And a lot of us were, even on my grandmother's side, they were landowners, and her family's farm was swallowed up by a banana plantation too. So it's like they lost land. My grandfather was a, working class, lower than working class. So he came here. He worked at a petroleum factory in Detroit. Met my grandma here. So that's the Boricua side. There's my grandfather has like very curly hair. He's pretty dark skinned. So he's like a Afro Boricua person. So I got my West African ancestry via largely my grandpa's side. But we're mixed. Puerto Ricans are the lightest of the Caribbean. Caribbean being a pretty black region,
And then let me say this too.
Yeah.
If you travel to Puerto Rico, you'll be surprised. A lot of the abuelas and a lot of other things. But this is back to the weaponization of even colorism and race that enters in, because a lot of the messages that go across and you have like this. You have so many misunderstandings. Comedian Ada Rodriguez would be good to like look at like some of her jokes about it, but in those jokes are some truths about the ways that a lot of and it's tough because you want to say Latin, but Latin is just what was imposed upon that group of people. The Caribbean islands have been, I guess, indoctrinated with these beliefs through Western idealism.
Yeah, and these identities and these names that refer to themselves. Even the name Antilles is like another name, that refers to the region. That's a Spanish given name. But Boricua is like what a lot of us like call ourselves from the island. But Taino is like the indigenous ancestry there. But like I was saying, it's like very mixed. There's Irish, there's Greek, there's Spanish, there's like probably like, North African. There's a lot of like mixed West African. So there's a lot of admixture in the Puerto Rican side, but Boricua is like, they always talk about it as like the three races coming together to make Boricua people. So that's that side. And then for my dad, my grandparents are from northern Mexico and southern Texas. My dad has a lot of native ancestry. We did DNA test. He's like 60%. And that's like people from northern Mexico and southern Texas.
And I want you to expand on that.
Yeah.
I've had a couple other, here we go, Chicanos here.
Yeah, there you go.
And I think that I think it's a lot of misunderstandings because as Americans, we just look at it like Mexico is Mexico. But Mexico is, it's like, it's like all of this stuff. It's imaginary lines that were drawn up by colonizers
100%.
to kind of define what things are. A lot of people, when you deep dive into even the Spanish-American War and the quote-unquote Alamo and all of this stuff, and even brothers like me, the Buffalo Soldiers, like, it's misunderstandings about what happens. But I bring this up because even here's the classic one when it comes to food. So a lot of people here in Detroit, I know, will say like, oh, I like, Detroit Mexican food ain't like Mexican food when I go to LA. And it's like, okay, that is because it's certain portions of Chicanos that came to Detroit. And a lot are from that part of like northern, the Agave region. Shout out to my homie Antonio with Cabresto and a lot of his family and the Lopez, they're my people. So like I've learned more about this, and it's kind of like Italy because folks know more about that. Red sauce or white sauce. It's different cultures, different dialects. It's different ways your clothing, food, just a lot of different things. And I think that region of northern Mexico, what we now call northern Mexico, is so entrenched in Detroit culture when we think of Mexican town.
Yeah, even the automobile, there's a lot of automobile manufacture on that border of the United States and northern Mexico, southern Texas. Northern Mexico has a lot of influences from polka and the folk music, so there's a lot of like European influences there. They also have more flour tortillas, so you have more of a dynamic mix of like they call Tex-Mex food that you see up here in Detroit. So it's more uniform. There's not as much, I love tacos in Southwest, but it definitely is not like the taco capital of the world. There's good stuff there, but like not like there is in like San Antonio, not like there is in like Houston, not like there is in LA.
Yeah.
And obviously those places are also like located to the water. And this is a separate topic we can talk about later. But like, man, we're a city on the water, and we don't have hardly any seafood here. Detroit, you wouldn't even know by the food culture in Detroit that we are a city right on the straits in the middle of the Great Lakes. We got all this like access to walleye and whitefish, but there's a big disconnect between us and the water here in Detroit. But back to Mexico and that sort of like history in that region. So yeah, like Chicano are like Mexican Americans. My dad identified as a Chicano, and like. If you look at a map of Mexico and you like, where are the reservations? There are no reservations in Mexico because like all of the indigeneity was subsumed. Like there are huge swaths of Mexico where they still speak Mayan languages.
And let me say this too. In this, the whole concept of build the wall and these people are quote unquote illegal immigrants, which is weird. It's like until this whole concept really that goes back to Haiti or Haiti or what was labeled that. Like the Louisiana Purchase, more history, triggered a couple different things to happen. France and Napoleon just backed out of any territories here. And when that happened, it's like, oh, let's just give this Louisiana Purchase and basically say to families like Donald Trump's family definitely did this, and many others, quote unquote, like you may know it from the video game when I was in middle school, Oregon Trail, that are just saying, oh, you can frontier and go out west.
Yeah.
Out west was what we now, quote unquote, label as native lands or what we consider Chicano. So like a lot of this was already a part. So we're saying that like they're illegal, whereas like, one second, you all just drew this imaginary line when we have roots that go back centuries to New Mexico, Arizona, Texas,
Colorado,
as
far
Oklahoma.
North. That was once Mexico. I mean, and before that was all native land, and there was no difference between the native people north and the south.
Yes.
The difference is who colonized them and the orientation of that colonization. So, like, you have the world of English settler colonialism in the 13 colonies on the east coast of the United States.
Yes.
That happened very rapidly, very quickly. So you find an absorption of those people into white culture. There are still people who are representing those early contacted in the 1700s, 1600s tribes. But similarly, the Spanish kind of settled and colonized in Mexico, and they created the Spanish colonial missions. Those colonial missions were like those, like Jamestown. Like, so they were like church communities that came up on rivers and routes as the Spanish came in, and certain Mexican populations would assimilate into those Spanish colonial missions as there were people were wiped out by disease, as their cultures were kind of destabilized. And then you had more cultures like the Comanches, who were like frontiers people, who were like horse people, who like fought, you know, and they stayed, you know, hunter-gatherer move. And there's a lot of wars fought between the United States, Mexico, and the Comanche and the Apache people.
And then I got to throw in more information of brothers and sisters that have known this, but it's just being propagated more. But even the Maroon cultures, where you start mixing, and some of this even goes back further, where it's clearly defined that Maroon, Moor, and this is what's so unique when you study even European history that ties into this, because the Moorish people, when we think of Hannibal and the way that the Moors, as they say, ruled Europe. So like this black rule this black order in Spain and Portugal that existed, and then even set up these trade routes, because there was many of those quote unquote Moors that were on a lot of these ships that knew the trade winds to get to these Caribbean islands. And just due to the way that you're talking about the institutionality of the way that Portugal, the Portuguese and the Spanish went about how they would want to colonize versus the way the English settlers, just due to, you know, a lot of the people that founded quote unquote the United States of America were more like outcasted in the first place. It changed the perspective using the church, Catholicism. It goes into a lot of things that now people ingratiate themselves in as like, oh, this was what always existed, but this was always in design, through design. And it, like I say, it has layers that go back hundreds of years.
Yeah, thousands of years. More than hundreds of years, thousands of years.
Very good point.
So I think like I read a book recently that really helped me like reframe my understanding of like world history in a big way. I think like there have been attempts to help like people understand like how European people came to like kind of dominate the world in a major way, dominate the oceans, become like a global empire. The West often thinks of itself as the first global empire. And like my sort of understanding is like these people are actively erasing history. Like when they were colonized by the Moors and the North African people and the Arab empires, they were in the Dark Ages. You know, they weren't bathing, they were shitting in the street. I mean, like London existed a long time before England existed. London was a Roman colony. So this book that I'm talking about is called A Forest Journey by John Perlin. And it looks at the history of civilization's relationship with forests. So since the dawn of man, trees have been our primary source of energy. For the most part. I mean, there's been like, you know, like little like whale fucking fat, or maybe like there's some oil on the surface they use for lamps in different cultures. There are examples of alternate forms of energy, but primarily what fueled large-scale civilization was lumber, was wood. And that wood was necessary for making pottery. That wood was necessary for making plaster. That wood was necessary for making homes. That wood was necessary for making metal. So as the civilization would get big, they'd get agriculture, they'd grow big, they'd get different like technologies. They would utilize all of the wood around them. And then they would have to begin to colonize out other areas in order to pull resources and pull wood. And as those areas that were being colonized, they became central hubs. So like civilization kind of like echoed out that way. And if you get into like the Graham Hancock sort of like understanding of history, like a lot of the Sahara was not a desert. It was big. The biggest lake in the history of like humanity was the Chad Super Lake. And that's why there's like all sorts of drawings in North Africa and the Sahara of like animals that would only exist by water. And there were huge civilizations in that North Africa, Mediterranean region too, that were like, you know, the ancestors of some of the great civilizations that we understand to be the civilizations of the last 10,000 years from which we often measure history now. So like the Middle East was all forests. I mean, the cedars of Lebanon is something like you often hear. It's on the Lebanese flag, the cedar tree. All of those forests were deforested by those early civilizations. Egypt ran out of trees. So if you look at the history of empire and the history of civilization, they would run out of trees and they would all turn to permaculture at the end of their civilization. As their civilization ran out of trees, ran out of energy, they'd begin to like point their homes towards the sun. They'd make their homes out of plaster. They would do all sorts of techniques to like save on the wood. And if you look at like what we're doing with our agriculture and with our construction and our homes now, is we're turning towards like different types of permaculture principles. So, boom, reconnecting.
Yeah. And everything you're saying, and I love it. Like I said, this is going to be a fun one. This is going to be a deep dive, as you see, and we're going to get back to family and all that.
But don't
like
pivot off the
usual.
Moors. I want to
But
keep with the Moors piece for a second because there were many global civilizations pre-American contact. Like
Very much
everybody wants to say that there were only, the Europeans were the first people to discover America, but the Europeans had been wiped out by a sea people a bunch of times all along those Mediterranean civilizations, a handful of times. And those were like kind of Moorish, North African people who were also plugged in with the Norsemen. So like that movie of like where there's like Antonio Banderas and he's like hanging out with all these Norse people as the Moor who's hanging out with them. They're finding a lot of like Norse DNA that has mixed in with that North African Moorish DNA.
Yeah.
So these people were like, there were Norse Scandinavian people who came to the Americas, Leif Erikson. There were Chinese people who came to the Americas. There were African people who came to the Americas.
Many.
And even like there are records within Columbus's data that in the islands of the Antilles and the Puerto Rico and the Cuba,
Yes.
where they said, yeah, there are black people who have
Very
come here
much so.
before. So like there's a lot of trade and exchange, and this isn't the first globalization. Every empire hits their peak and they think they're unique and they think their technology's the top, and they kind of all lose their way. And I think that's where the American empire is right now in terms of at its peak, thinking it's the best, thinking it's the only. And I'll say this, I know for sure if you look at all the wars that the United States and the Western world has had against the Arab world, they want to erase that. Like in history books in the United States, we're taught that we have a direct connection to the Greeks and the Romans. Like, bitch, no, you don't.
No.
You don't. You were colonized by the Romans, and then that London went into decline. And when Rome and Greece went into decline, the Arab world took all their libraries and translated all their books. And it was those Arab North African empires who brought that book back to European people and brought them out of the Renaissance.
And I mean,
then they came to took over the world.
And this is what makes the design, and I know people are like, oh, Kari's so pro-black. Kari is so pro-black. But some of this is just through when you study history. But even like the running of the bulls, like people look at that as like, oh, this is like some special concept that we do in Spain. The bull represents black people, and it's the running the Moors out of Spain. That's what this represents. Also, the clear...
I mean, look at graduation ceremonies in the United States. Who are we dressing like? We're dressing like those North African, like mixture, sometimes Muslim empires that existed. Like that's who the university system is based off. But they like to credit with Germans. Yeah, Germans definitely did that. But who were the Germans copying? Where were the Germans sending their people before for their first universities and their first college and their first PhDs and their first master's programs? You are wearing that thobe because it's representing a culture that's bigger than this. Like, there was a poll that was something like, should we teach our kids Arab numerology? Bitch, that's what we all teach our kids. Yeah, that's what our number system is. Yeah, it comes from algebra, which comes from,
mathematics comes
North Africa, Middle East, Egypt, those regions.
And so much of this within science and technologies, mathematics, like, you understand, like, some of the ways that we've been conditioned to look at things. Hence, I'm into marketing. I like messaging. So I do recognize the conditioning and the onboarding, but this is the other concept than, as me and Baba Malik always debated. I'm not as anti-capitalism as most. I'm anti-white supremacy, or a lot of people use homogeny nowadays, but like the machine is different because the look at the lens of this, the one gripe I do have about this is ownership. And what does ownership mean? And this whole concept of ownership. So You have cultures that didn't that interacted, like I say, with nature a whole lot more, and the whole idea of ownership. Because the idea now with the lens is like, oh man, how could you just let people take your land, or how could you just let people, sell you into enslavement? It's like you're looking at it from the lens of an understanding of conditioning that we have now, without the understanding of the savagery that a lot of those European tribes were battling one another for. Like, as you talk about the Dark Ages, they were in intense battles, cultivating reasons and violence and the scarcity of living in the European region for hundreds and thousands of years. It's like you get other civilizations closer to an abundance of fresh water, fresh food, living more with nature and harmony. But now you get some of that savagery to travel the world, hence what's labeled as Vikings, pirates, and stuff like that.
They were a woodlot. They were a woodlot, just like they used to say that a squirrel could jump from tree to tree from the Mississippi to the Atlantic coast before the European colonizers came here and cut down all the trees. Yeah. That's the history of Michigan. Yeah. From 1830s to 1930, that 100-year period, they clear-cut all the trees. And there was the value of all those trees was more valuable than the gold rush in California. Yeah. The trees of Michigan. And they were a woodlot too. They were colonized by empires of the Mediterranean, North African, Middle Eastern regions. Yeah. So like they perpetuated what happened to them. And now, fast forward, America's a world power, and now guess what happens? We're using social media to overthrow Egypt. Social media revolution, Arab Spring to overthrow Egypt. Social media revolution to overthrow Syria. Revolutions to overthrow Baghdad. And what happens when we overthrow those countries? They burn the libraries. Egypt library burned. Baghdad library burned. I mean, it's no incidents like that. It was actually Assyrian wheat, because wheat evolved in like corn evolved in Latin America. Potatoes, corn, tomatoes, a lot of squashes, peppers. Those are all Latin American. But wheat, that comes from the Middle East region, the Tigris and Euphrates. So they had ancient wheat varieties in Syria. So when the United States tried to overthrow the Syrian government, they were able to take their wheat, and that wheat actually saved global wheat production because they took those seeds, they stole those seeds, and it saved a lot of wheat because there's a lot of like wheat diseases that were spreading across the world, and it was a Syrian wheat disease that they stole by trying to overthrow that country. So they're raiding the seeds, they're raiding the knowledge, because they want to erase that part of history because those are the people who colonized them. Those Europeans want to erase it, and they want to make themselves, Western Europeans want to make themselves direct connections to the Greeks and the Romans, and that's not true. Those are not your people. And those people didn't study up and learn all out by themselves, too. All those Greek and Roman philosophers were studying in Egypt. They were studying in the empires that came before them. And we tend to think of, like, Arab people as, like, savages and backwards and shit like that, and these countries as, like, old school and, like, abusive and, anti-feminism and these sorts of things. But, like, the libraries, like those were open civilizations. So a lot of those Arab empires.
Let me give some classic game, and you all know it. Like people talk about Persian rugs, Persia, Iran, like the connection between both, and maybe for thousands of years, Persia was exalted and held in the esteem of an Egypt throughout the world of like, yo, you want to connect there because the way and the style, and then even our misunderstanding, hence, like I say, our conditioning sees things from a different lens. This past week, Kamala Harris was visiting African countries in Ghana. And even I was, and a lot of people, like, I mean, from Americans' lens, we turn it on the TV and it's like, wow, she's over there with the brothers and sisters. But the brothers and sisters were like, hey, America, we know that you subverted and murdered Kwame Nkrumah, and we know you owe us for that. Give us this back. So this welcoming of, I guess, what looks good here domestically versus what's said internationally is a different lens. And I'm not necessarily putting an onus on Kamala Harris herself, but in representing the state and how Ghanaians and people in Africa are seeing America. It ain't the same old America before, and like the welcome open arms and what we can sometimes believe because of certain things that have been done to these nations over time because of America.
Yeah, so I have some connect this in with this Baba Malik moment on capitalism. I would say I'm an anti-capitalist, but I would also say that like capitalism is short fucking term thinking. You know, like same thing with like, are you socialist? Are you a communist? Like, no, I don't identify as any of those things.
And I like that you said that.
Those are all like short term understandings. Like, to me, I think of capitalism as America's reform for colonialism. I mean, the United States like pushed, took over for England, kind of pushed them out. England tried to, fight who's that? The homie in Egypt, and lost. And that was like their big moment of like, oh fuck, the British Empire is done.
Yeah.
So the United States empire takes over, and the United States, the Bretton Woods Agreement. I mean, that's what's crumbling now.
Yeah.
The Bretton Woods Agreement, which is like what makes the dollar the global reserve currency, that happened after World War II, and that's like kind of the second like real transition where the United States took power.
It really, yes. It's like I often say, and I say this, people that watch Detroit is different. As I say, America, and this is why my gripe of what people say is capitalism. Yeah. I say this isn't really real capitalism at what from reading.
Well, capitalism is just a word. It's just a word. It's just an English word.
But the whole concept of like, me from business school, where supply meets demand, and then then you have a trade connected to that transaction.
And the that reason has happened for centuries and centuries and centuries.
Exactly.
And capitalism is like what, a couple hundred years old?
And what but here, even under and I've never went cover to cover with it, but I own Wealth of Nations, Adam Smith's book, which is really a lot of stolen information from Egypt. But still, here nor there, my gripe is always it's stolen land, it's stolen labor, and it's a stolen loan. Mm-hmm. It's stolen land. This is not USA and all of that stuff. Stolen labor, our people.
Yep.
Definitely my people. And stolen loan. That loan, the whole concept of the British Tea Party, the way it's sold to America, it makes it seem like, oh, no taxation without representation. No. America leveraged its position in the world between the Dutch, the Portuguese, and the Spanish to say, yo, guess what? Next time Britain coming over here, we about to take it back to them. Will y'all buy our sugar? Will y'all buy our stuff? And we not going to pay Britain nothing. Yep. So it almost would be like, if this is like street knowledge for you all that watch BMF or something like that, like if somebody set you up with a place to do business, gave you the money to start your business, help you get labor in that business, and now you're functioning well with the business for about 3 or 4 years, and then they like, hey man, what about my percentages? And then you turn around and say, I ain't honoring that. That's America. So to call that capitalism, if you give me some labor, some land, and a loan to start a business, and then you say, hey, let supply meet demand, that's not
what makes it
here,
different, America, also, on top of what you're saying, is they forced the European countries to give up their colonies all over the world. So that was like what happened after World War II.
After World War II. But and then
so
even
that's
like
the change.
Science,
that's the transition.
Yes, that was like the nail in the coffin.
And colonialism. And the United States is like, that colonialism shit is done. Mm-hmm. Now we're going to do it with finance. And now we're going to do it with the IMF. Mm-hmm. Now we're going to do it with the World Bank. Mm-hmm. So we transitioned from a colonialism that was based on land and theft of land and theft of resources from, like these areas and extraction to a colonialism is like, okay, we'll finance that. And if you can't pay that loan back, we're going to take it from you.
I have to add a little bit more information, and shout out to Russ Beland for gaming me up and having me dive deeper into this type of stuff. But like NATO itself. So America stepped over to a lot of those European nations like, you're in no position to rebuild. You're in no position to this. What we're going to do is we're going to tax Germany for forever to help in the quote unquote axis of evil, Germany, Japan, Italy, to put all this stuff back together. And what we'll do is we're going to create this NATO. And that'll be a military force. So basically, you don't even have to worry about military force. And we're going to sit here as America because we're in the best position. Yep. And this is also the other gangsterism of America, even with World War II. As we know, Henry Ford and America supplied most of the weapons and the supplies for the weapons to the axis of evil. So America played both sides of the game. And obviously, the one nation that America did choose to attack was the nation really with people of color in Japan, for what it's worth. So this is like a key point in what happened with World War II that I want to bring up, that America was playing both sides. So like
absolutely.
basically it was kind of like waiting.
Financing too. Financing
Yeah.
both sides.
Yeah, it'd be like, you know, it's the end of the schoolyard, and I saw somebody get like 6 punches in, and it's like, man, it looks like Antonio losing. All right, so let me go on and stump him at the end and be like, hey, man, we had your back the whole time.
And we won this thing. You know, like, we won World War II. It's
Yes.
like, no, it was the Russians who won that shit. Like,
Very much so.
millions and millions of their citizens beat the Germans.
I left that key detail about NATO out. The one rule of NATO was that Russia, the USS, the Soviet Union cannot join NATO.
Yeah.
So hence NATO becomes an occupying force, basically being an anti-Russian, anti-communist occupation. And you're right. The USSR basically took on the brunt force of the Blitzkrieg and all of the best of what Nazi Germany had to offer. About 2/3 of the
weapons and shit supplied by the U.S. Yep.
Yes, with different strategies, which actually was like many strategies learned from like a lot of, like, as you say, the people. Man, I'm forgetting some of the Moors, some of the people in Haiti, like the whole, like, we're going to kill most of the villages and we're gonna make them suffer through hunger. Mm-hmm. Because as they move further closer with the occupation, we're going to burn everything down. This is like a strategy definitely known, really, that comes straight from the people, you know, the Chicano people in
revolutionary movements. Yeah.
Yes, like we're not going to let you eat at all. So as you move further to come closer to where the Kremlin is, you're going to lose all your supplies. You're going to lose your troops. You're going to have famine. You're going to deal with other things. And then when you try to deal with this Russian winter, that's really going to be a key war tactic against what's happening. But it definitely repositioned America as a quote unquote peacemaker, world leader, the dominance, and basically, you know, America got to set.
And that's capitalism. That's the capitalism.
Yes,
that's why I'm against capitalism.
Yes,
but I'm not against markets. I'm not against exchange.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not against, like, I think those things are sacred. Mm-hmm. I think production is sacred. I think anybody who's like out there making things, producing things, those are really important people. And that has existed long before capitalism. And a lot of times, like, the left in the United States tends to like ignore this history and just like stick within this like communist socialism space. And that's just so Eurocentric ultimately at the end of the day. It's like, it's a very Eurocentric understanding of the sacredness of markets and the sacredness of exchange.
And also,
so I believe in that. But
and also socialism and capitalism, socialism and communism, when we see it, quote unquote, in action and in practice, has not definitely been balanced, especially for black folks either. And that's usually what I push back on. It's like socialism, as we see in Cuba, is definitely some opportunities for some people there. But when we think about colorism and racism, that's one of the most gutter places.
I mean, I would say, you know, Cuba actually is like less racist than a lot of places, I would say. They actually have like anti-racism in the constitution of that country. That's one of the like, you know, not many countries have that within the constitution explicitly. Like while they says all men are created equal, they also say like the slaves who were insisting the British need to get fucking decapitated. I mean, our constitution says both of those things. Yeah. So like their constitution is anti-racist, and they're like have done much better. And if you look at like what Cuba's impact is on the world, they support revolutionary movements. And when there's emergencies, they send doctors all over the world. So I fuck with Cuba heavy. And the part about like socialism versus capitalism that I like is an honorable part is like Kwame Nkrumah and all these dudes. They were socialists because they were fighting back in this post-colonial period as the colonial empires were extracting themselves and looking to maintain whatever control they could as they were moving away from occupation. Yeah. And so that's why you get like the French Monetary Union. That's why French is the biggest colonial empire that still exists in Europe. There are 14 African countries who are using the French monetary system. As I mentioned earlier, colonialism transferred to a financial type of colonialism. Definitely. And that's what it is now. Under capitalism, it's a financial type of colonialism. And the agreement that was also part of that transfer was called the Bretton Woods Agreement. And Bretton Woods is a location, I think it's like New Hampshire or Vermont or something like that. It's like it's a ski place.
One of those 13 colonies.
Yeah, in those areas. So like it's a ski resort. And before the war was over, the United States invited all these countries to this Bretton Woods, to this out of season ski resort. And they were like, okay, we're gonna design the world order here. So like this war is almost over. You still need us to win this victory. You still need Europe had destroyed all of the factories. They'd all destroyed each other's places for production. So they needed the United States. We were not destroyed in that war. So our industry was dominant. After the war, United States industry was like 70% of global industrial production. So that's like the golden era. When everybody talks about, like, when Trump's like, make America great again, this is what he's referring to, is this period in American history where we became the dominant world global empire. And at those meetings, the United States basically said is, we'll patrol the world's oceans, we'll secure the world. You will trade in dollars.
Yep.
Those dollars will be tied to gold. And for that, you're going to help us fight communism.
Yep.
And that became the milieu for the next 70, 80 years. We are now exiting that system.
Yes.
We exited the gold standard in the 1970s under Nixon. It was hyperinflation. It was that same hyperinflation of the 70s that led to the neoliberal sort of movement of today, that led to the Chicago School of Economics, that led to, this like sort of like U.S. version of colonialism, which was, as you were saying, like the type of warfare that the United States learned and sharpened the tools of empire in Latin America.
Yeah.
It was in fighting and suppressing socialist movements.
Yeah, read Economic Hitman, one of my favorite books.
Yes,
read that one.
Certainly.
Definitely.
Yeah, Open Veins of Latin America by Edward Galeano. Yeah. Harvest of Empire by Juan Cole. These are all books that are really good. Another one is Empire's Workshop by Greg Grandin. This is a really good book. And that book is specifically about the ways in which the United States learned counterinsurgency warfare. The same type of warfare they did in Syria, the same type of warfare they did in Afghanistan, the same type of warfare they did in Nicaragua. And that Nicaragua warfare is the one that funded crack in the hood.
Yeah.
So global capitalism,
I think
American role.
This is a Kari thing.
Heroin.
I do think, yes, a lot of people wonder, like, oh man, why is opioid so, why do we have this opioid crisis? It just runs right concurrent with the occupation of Afghanistan, which produces the best and most poppy in the world. Like, and I mean, this is just like even Zarqawi, like, I know we're talking international.
Which is fentanyl, which is,
yes.
All those opiates.
All of it.
So Vicodin, fentanyl, hydrocodone.
All of these are definitely tied to a way that it's like we can monetize it, and so much of this, like when it sounds scary and all of that stuff, but it's just more the awareness and back to the conditioning and how we look at the world, how we see the world purview of like you say, goods. How they travel, who controls what, having those levers of control.
What drugs are legal in what places, who gets to sell them, who brings them in, who produces them, where are they processed. Man, and like the British sharpened that knife of using drugs as a tool of empire.
And that's why
with the opium wars in China.
I mean, and that's where, you just went right there. And that's why Mao said, look, get all of these British people, because the effects of how Britain hooked a lot of the Chinese into opium and what that is as a depressant.
So let's just back up on this British-Japanese situation. So China has always been a producer. They've always been a nation that has like made the silk, they made gunpowder. They were selling things that were valuable to wealthy Western people. So a lot of Western people were buying their shit, and there was a trade deficit. A lot of gold and a lot of silver and a lot of valuable shit was going to China. So like, how can we balance this out? We need to be able to take something back. The West didn't have nothing that the Chinese people wanted. So they started pushing opium into those communities as a way to balance the trade. And the China started seeing like their, elite, wealthy men becoming addicts, not being functional men, not doing well when they were on these drugs. So they said, no, that shit is illegal. We don't want that. We're not going to allow you to do it. So Britain parked up in their harbor, started destroying people with their advanced weapons, gunpowder that they had taken from Chinese people and used it as weapons. And then they took over China and led to the I don't think it was Mao, it was a government before him, but like that led to I think it's like 200 years of shame in Chinese history, where they thought themselves as the Middle Kingdom, the chosen people, and then they were colonized by the British and then the Japanese and all these things that happened. But it was the usage of drugs for war.
Very much so.
Yeah, and that's, in the United States, turned that on black and brown communities that were pushing for their rights in the 60s and 70s.
Very much so.
It was an exchange between the Iran-Contra scandal, Gary Webb is the journalist who discovered this, and he was suicided after making this discovery. I don't know if you're up on this. Like,
yeah, he said, Gary Webb actually shot himself in the head twice for suicide, which is
with a shotgun. Really hard to do.
Which
really
is
hard. You gotta use
phenomenal.
You got to use your pinky toe.
Yeah, twice. Phenomenal. It's like, how did he shoot himself twice in the head with a shotgun? You know?
Yeah. So that was the Iran-Contra scandal. And that was the time when the United States liked Iran. There was a time when we fuck with Iran because it was a balance of power against the Arab empires that we were trying to
Hence this whole concept of the Cold War, meaning like this idea of America waging war against Russia, which is actually happening right now in the Ukraine.
Yep.
Through proxy nations.
Yep. And that's counterinsurgency warfare. Exactly. It's like we don't want to spill our blood. We don't want to send our troops there. It's the most like gaslighty, shitty thing what we're doing to Ukraine. It's insane. It's like we'll like, hey Ukraine, your boyfriend's fucked up. He's real abusive to you. Come over, just join the EU. You know, we'll take care of you. You could join NATO. We'll defend you if you join NATO. And Ukraine's like, okay, sure. And then like bam, they get fucking hit in the head, and we're like, okay, just take these weapons and fight.
Yeah,
it's insane. Like if the West is gonna like offer to the Ukrainian Slavic people. I mean, those people are this. Russian and Ukrainian are 70% mutually intelligible languages. They're the same people. They're Slavic people.
Yeah, it's like it's not even like Portuguese and Spanish. It's a lot of layers. Check my Russ Belant interview. It's a lot of information out there on it. And now this is like, wow. Like I say, even when we would talk, I knew this was going to be an engaging one, man. And we talked so much about, and I can't wait to even get you back with this. But even more so, like I know now I'm really coming back home. Your story here. I know you mentioned definitely Boricua, Chicano, like how did that connection happen in Detroit?
Yeah, so my grandpa he was in the military. He got out. He had PTSD. He was getting into too much trouble. He was drinking. So he had a welding certificate. He got in the Navy, and white people were getting paid more to do the same work without a certification. So he's like, "Fuck that." His cousin was already here in Detroit. He's like, "Come up. You go work in the auto industry." Okay. My grandpa came up here. He got a job welding, building conveyor belts for the auto industry. Yeah, and then so my dad was born in Texas. He summoned for my grandma to come up here when my dad was 5.
So your granddad met your grandma in Texas?
Yep, married her right out the Navy. She was very young.
That old school.
She was like 18 and wow. She was real young.
And then and I'm unfamiliar with like Puerto Rican culture in Texas. What is that
Mexican,
like?
That's Mexican. So my dad is Mexican.
Okay.
So my dad is like said he's like a lot of native. He identified as Chicano, but north. So his father's side is from San Luis Potosí, northern Mexico. My people are Peyote people. So I'm a reconnecting person, indigenous ancestry. So I go down to Texas a couple times a year and sit up in ceremony.
I hope it ain't in the summertime.
I actually don't go in the. So what I've been doing is I've been taking my bees down in the spring, in the fall, and I pick them up in the spring. So I go in the fall and the spring. The best time to be in Texas is in the fall.
Yeah,
and the
I was
spring.
gonna say because
during the rainy season. Yeah, it's hot. I've never been down there for a Texas summer.
Oh man,
I don't necessarily intend to.
It's
I got roots down there, but man, I'm a Great Lakes boy now.
All right, so
my parents met, connected. I think they met like in the 70s, late 70s, early 80s. Yeah, no, 80s. They met in the 80s at a club here in Detroit.
And I'm saying that because Boricua culture, like, really, it's of a lot of, like, I think you have, it's just different just due to, I don't know what are the paths that lead to different places. New York, everything's in New York. But outside of New York, it's certain pockets. I think Boston, I think certain cities. That's why, like, any Boricuas here in Detroit, it's like, that's unique. You know what I'm saying? They exist. You know, like Angela, I had the Angela interview not too long ago. I know Paul, but like, it's not like a like certain places you like, damn, I feel like I'm in Puerto Rico. You know what I'm saying?
Well, we talked about the Puerto Ricans being the lightest skin of the Antilles, of the Caribbean area. They also, the other privilege that they also have is that they're the ones that are citizens.
That share in, yes.
So a lot of people from Dominican Republic, from Haiti, from Jamaica, from Dominique, if they want to come to the United States, they go to Puerto Rico. Because Puerto Ricans have citizenship. So it's easier for Puerto Ricans to come here. I'm an independista. I would like to see Puerto Rico become a separate nation. I think that colonial status that Puerto Rico has in relation to the United States is a deterrence. I mean, there's more Walmarts per capita than anywhere else than in Puerto Rico. I mean, it's like too much. Their economies is too capitalism, too much Americanized, too much McDonald's, a lot of like obesity, a lot of welfare. It was a place where like the pharmaceutical industry was hiding for a long time, tax shelter for them. Now it's become like the crypto bro sort of thing, and crypto's falling apart now that the Fed is rolling up interest rates, and now there's less money floating around, so crypto's for the most part done for. I'm not saying the technology is done for, but like
it's really the
boom
now
of
we're
the
getting
era, is done
exchanges. I think the currencies will be around for a long time, but the exchanges were intentionally attacked in this whole destabilizing of the dollar.
Now governments are trying to take over the blockchain. Now governments are looking to take it over.
That's not gonna. Well, that's a whole nother discussion.
Yeah, it is another discussion.
Yeah. As you see, it's like I know people are like, damn. I know you pulling out I know you guys got your phones and you like looking at Wikipedia, Googling. Google all this stuff. It's some information, but this is the stuff that be going on in my head and obviously Antonio's head, where like people are like, how you know all this stuff? And it's like, because I'm a nerd about some of this information.
Well, I studied economics in college, so like I have a background in economics, which is why I
didn't know that. Okay.
Yeah, so like I love economic history. There's if people want to like learn about economics, an economist I really love, Ha Jun Chang.
Okay, now I'm gonna definitely take some.
He's a South Korean economist. He has a lot of really good books about like one of them is like 21 Things They Never Told You About Capitalism. Really good book. Or Lies About Capitalism. He has another book called Kicking Away the Ladder, which is looking at the ways in which neoclassical economics doesn't allow third world countries to like grow through the same policies that allow them to grow.
No.
So it's really good. He's a really good author. David Harvey is a seminal author around neoliberalism. Super important thinker and writer. But yeah, man, I love economics. I think it's like, because I studied political science and I was studying it for a while.
What school?
Eastern Michigan.
Okay, and then before that, high school?
Detroit Catholic Central.
Okay. Oh, man, so we definitely got to get into that. Catholic Central.
Yeah.
Being there, and when we think about a parochial, they call it education, it has certain things and tenets that kind of go back to, it's so funny, like Moorish, Egyptian culture. Like, so when people say, wow, it's a better school, like these are models that usually go straight into things, even like the perishing and all of that stuff. How did you take to that school? Yeah. And did you notice that was different than like your friends that went to public schools?
Yeah, so I always like to think about it as like we were the richest of the poor people. In my neighborhood in Southwest where I grew up and I still live, right in the same block I grew up on. But like I had two parents my whole life, like I had my dad always worked full time, my mom hustled, did a lot of different jobs. So we were like solidly, like we were like either upper lower class or lower middle class, like we're like right up in there. You were like space.
You were like me. I got a rap line like it's like I grew up like the Cosbys around broken homes. So it's like because both parents very similar. My dad growing his practice when I was younger. It grew to a point of definitely success like around teenage. But that's how business is. Like you hit that stride. So you were in that mix already. So you already noticed some of the social differences.
Oh yeah.
Before you even noticed the school differences, because that was one thing that it's like I'm at this African Center school. I'm coming home talking to my friends about this is what I did today, and then they like, what are you talking about?
Yeah, so kind of reconnecting in with some things. The Puerto Rican side of my family is a bigger family. My dad was only 2, my mom was 5, and they kind of like, again, like Puerto Ricans being the lightest skin of the Caribbean people, they assimilated into the suburbs. Like a lot of them are like very white passing on the Puerto Rican side of my family, so they all moved to the suburbs. Me, my grandma, and my uncle are the only ones in our family left in the city. But like my family began to move to the western suburbs. So, like, my parents, like, they restrict, like, when we were little, it's like, you can only go between these houses. You go to the tree, you can go to this person's house, and that's it. So I had friends within this little bubble, and then that bubble grew. My grandma moved down the block, so I'd be able to go on her block, up and down the block. And then, like, we started bike riding up to my cousin's house in Warrendale. So then my mom, after, like, we did that for, like, a year or two, my mom let us go free. We could bike and be anywhere we wanted after that when we were, like, maybe, like,
11, like 10, 11.
Yeah, 10, 11. Yeah. So we were able to, like, be and go anywhere we want. I spent a lot of time in Warrendale and biking out to those communities. And part of that is reflective of, like, my family's history as Detroit, white flight, continuing and the Detroit like sort of situation was happening, and that like impacts education too. So like the neoliberal era, which a lot of my work focuses on neoliberalism, a lot of my research, a lot of my thinking, because that's our recent history. That's my life story, is like that time period is that we live in. And neoliberalism is essentially, it's free market fundamentalism. It's profits over people. It's privatization. If you want, like, what's the biggest word to understand neoliberalism is privatization. It's taking things that are in the public sphere, public water, public health, public utilities, and making them private resources.
Let me make it plain for them. You know how like a long time, most of your life, if you lived here, I'm 40, as old as me, you see the garbage truck driving down the street and it'd be a Detroit garbage truck, and now you see companies doing that.
Yep.
That's privatization.
Exactly. I mean, Duggan started his career privatizing the DMC. I mean, like, there's privatization. Like, back in the 30s, 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, there used to be so many hospital beds that were available for the mentally ill people. Privatization goes to the community health model, where there are way less beds, and you have Southwest Solutions now doing community health and like being mental health and giving out hella drugs. They switched from the inpatient model to the drug model, which put a lot of people in jail, a lot of homeless people in the streets, and now we house our mentally ill people mostly in prison.
Yeah.
So that's another example of privatization. Yeah, so like Governor Engler was the Ronald Reagan privatizer governor of Michigan.
Very much so.
And he instituted 3 policies that undermined the parochial schools, the schools that I went to, as well as the public schools. And I assume you went to public schools that you went to. So like those 3 policies that were enacted in the late 80s, early 90s are lifting the charter cap, so more charter schools can come in, because charter schools are for-profit schools. Making it per pupil funding, so every kid became worth a dollar amount. So that's how schools were funded, is based on the number of kids you had in a school. And the last one they did is open districting. So districts were allowed to vote and chose whether or not they would allow in kids from neighboring districts. So
1 second, let me give another point on this. Study some Joe Biden, and you're going to learn a lot about the busing crisis and other things like that. And he has some interesting words on this too, but continue.
Yeah, so these policies undermine the public school system. And this is just the last couple chapters in the history of Brown versus Board of Education. The original doctrine was separate but equal.
Yep.
20, 30 years later, they're like, separate but equal never fucking happened.
No.
So, like, they're like, yeah, these black schools are still underfunded and still shitty. So, the next Supreme Court case came. I forget the name of that case, but it was Thurgood Marshall who had, like, Thurgood Marshall, the first black justice, was against the decision in that case that mandated busing. So, it's like, why would, Thurgood Marshall be against busing? Because Thurgood Marshall was a smart, poignant, thinking man. He could see the future, and he's like, as soon as we mandate busing, white people will continue to move out from the communities that the black people are bussed into, and we're going to have harder segregation. And that's exactly the history.
What's happened? Yes.
That's exactly the history of probably your lifetime, anybody born in the 60s, 70s, 80s. That's that history right there. Detroit was one of the cases. This Supreme Court case was happening in Detroit. And bam, as soon as busing happened, white people began to remove their kids from those schools and flee further into the suburbs, where the federal government was subsidizing their ability to pass wealth down intergenerationally.
And let me also put this on there.
Redlining, all that whole history.
I was just about to go into redlining. As right now, just due to redlining laws, they'll say, well, you can't say what type of neighborhood it is. But the one thing any real estate agent can say is it's a good school district.
Yep.
Good school district means it's a lot of white kids here.
Yep.
Because if it's a lot of black kids there, it's a bad school district. So it's like a IE, you understand. And just through my just other work, I found that people usually are choosing where they buy their home based on where they want their kids to grow up.
Yep.
They want their kids to grow up near a good school.
Yep.
So these are other ways that are played with and segmented, and now you'll see like different things peppered in. But now as we see more, like, when we were younger, Southfield was like, wow, Southfield's such a good community and everything, because it was more mixed. But now it's to the point where Southfield is black, so it's not as good school district anymore. Yeah. So you go further out, Farmington, more black kids go there. It's going to not be a good school district. You move further and further and further and further away and around, and actually possibly move back to the city, and then come up with other ways to basically keep
In the 30s and 40s, black people were not allowed to move into the suburbs, but then they followed Jewish people who were also not allowed to buy houses. It's like you find a lot of contracts that say no Jews, no blacks allowed. But black people kind of followed Jewish people in the Southfield, and that stratified black wealth in a big way, where a lot of the middle class who could afford to get out of Detroit, chasing better schools, moved to Southfield. And it's like always a situation where you're chasing the American dream that's not available. And it goes right back to Brown versus Board of Education. So that's a long history of white flight, redlining, segregation, federal funding for the freeways erasing black bottom. There's a long history. That's the civil rights struggle. That's my parents' age and people 40 and over, Gen X to Boomer. But my generation, I'm 34. Our story is more the neoliberal era, where the chapter on this education history, which is related to spatial segregation history, is privatization. And Catholic schools in parochial districts were in decline is because you had to pay, a couple $1,000s to send your kids to a Catholic school, and it was worth it because you wanted to send your kid to a good school. These Catholic school parishes existed in Detroit because of parents like my parents, who were Detroit public school students, who said, we want to send our kids to Catholic school to get a better education, but we want to live in Detroit. So why send your kids to the school districts if you pay thousands of dollars if you could send them to Dearborn Heights for free, if you could send them to Ferndale for free? Because of open enrollment.
You know what? Because when I was in school, and shout out BC, Brandon Cotton. When I was in school, I remember DePorres had a heck of a basketball team. It was just known as a school, like DePorres, Bishop Borges. Like it just was. I remember
all the Catholic rec leagues. We was in there. Yeah,
and then and then it's like now I drive down, Gratiot. And I'm like, man, what happened to DePorres? Because it was an institution. You just broke down the whole concept that makes perfect sense. Why
those three policies in particular were really fundamental in undermining parochial schools, but they also undermined public schools. So, because every kid is worth $1, the kids from Detroit went to the suburbs. And if you talk to any young person from Detroit who's 50 years old or less, they have a story of going to school in Detroit and then going to school in the suburbs. Not everybody, but a lot of people. A lot of people.
It goes along those lines. I agree.
So we bleed students in suburbs, make money on black Detroit students.
And and I'll take it a step further, as I'm no longer that, but people know I was the Northwestern High School. I was the president alumni for forever. So for maybe about 7 years. So it would be interesting because most of the alumni are people that are retired. So I'd be sitting and talking to a lot of people that graduated in class of 64, class of 68, and their perspective of what should be happening in schools. But one of the biggest things that happens, as you say, in the open enrollment or even with the charter schools is the kid will start at the charter school, get into a fight, or he's too disruptive or she's too disruptive, whatever. Get kicked out. The place where they got to come back to is Northwestern.
Yep.
Because it is a public school.
So you get a concentration of kids. And it's also the kids who can't afford to be driven to other schools. Yes. So Detroit has a concentration of kids with mental health illness, has a concentration of kids who have single mother homes who can't afford to do that shit. So a concentration of kids who got kicked out of other schools, a concentration of kids who just can't afford to be taken. Even the kids, the places downtown. There's a concentration of schools downtown for fucking what? Because they want to make a class differentiation. Who can afford to have a parent who can drive them downtown for school?
But I do want to bring this point up too. Also the monies. You make that count day, and then we kick you out.
Exactly.
So now it's no money for this kid that has to have the doors open to. And not to mention all the tax chapter stuff.
And then there's the Bill Gates thing. This motherfucker owns a computer company. He's the leading person looking to privatize education and teach kids the test and reduce education to tests and exams. Yeah. The leading guy. What interest does Bill Gates have in reforming education?
The same when he got in farming. I mean,
but computers. Computers. Because he wants to replace teachers with computers. That's his interest in this. Is because computers. Yeah. So he's a leading education reformer. I mean, education reform is a joke. Education reform is about privatization. It's about profit. And this is where my critique of capitalism. I mean, fuck it. If you're cool, if you're smart, you come up with a curriculum you can sell to one of these institutions. Good for you. Make your money. I'm not going to poo-poo on you for working within that system. But all that is to say is this for-profit education system that we live in where we don't pay teachers shit. We have broken communities where the kids, parents can't afford to make sure they're doing their homework, getting paid shitty Amazon wages, have to work a ton of fucking hours just to get by, whether that be Amazon or motherfucking Quicken Loans. Can't afford to be a parent because they're so busy working. I mean, it's a race to the bottom.
I agree. And this kind of Eastern. How did you choose Eastern? As I think Eastern plays a different role. I've interviewed a couple different Eastern graduates, and I thought that more so than a lot of the other schools, Eastern, Michigan State maybe second, as being a PW predominantly white institution, has been very successful, especially at one pocket getting a lot of black students there, but just being more of a welcoming body to people from Detroit. Why did you choose Eastern? What was the feel there?
It was more affordable. My brother was going there.
Okay.
My dad had went there for a little while. Ypsilanti's a black city. Like it was like a easier transition to live in Ypsilanti versus like
East Lansing.
East Lansing or U of M. I don't know. Like I was not like I didn't apply myself the most in high school. I probably had like a 3-point average. I loved Eastern because it was small enough that there was a lot of opportunity there. You know, I went on to become student body president there. I was president of Latino Students Association. I was hyperactive. I went on study abroads. I was able to do stuff that maybe I wouldn't have at U of M. You know?
Okay, and let's talk a little bit about that, because this is what's so unique about Eastern, because it is so juxtaposing down the street from U of M, but it's like a world of cultural differences. Yeah. How, as you were forming a lot of these thoughts, because obviously you wanted to tap into a lot of this stuff, what was the impact on just seeing U of M down the street and then seeing
U of M was kind of irrelevant. Like where U of M, I was engaged with that a little bit was in the tuition equality movement. I would say like I didn't think of U of M at all, really. I was focused on school. I was focused on, like, getting busy at Eastern. You know, sometimes I would party up in Ann Arbor. But when I first started going to Eastern, it was a party college, actually. It was, like, a much different. It was much less of a community college than it is now.
Oh, yeah. It definitely, the culture, I don't know when, but I say maybe, like, around, like, 2012,
all
13.
Those Snyder appointees, all those Snyder appointees have turned it into like, a... Eastern Michigan Incorporated. You know, it's become a more pro-business and like less like, you know, they defunded a lot of the social student life. They'd spent a lot of money trying to cultivate an on-campus vibe, a life in that community, and then they started cracking down on Greek life in a big way. And that really like, I mean, yeah, I had a ton of fun though at Eastern. And when I had a ton of fun. Me and my brother had a real fun party house. But so like how I came to like be who I am through my time at Eastern is I was studying. So first I was studying clinical lab studies. I wanted to be a pharmacist. I had sold weed growing up in high school to all suburban kids. It was a good way to make money.
Hey, there you go.
And I'm like, shit, man. Like, I'll just sell drugs. Cool.
Use your stereotype to your advantage.
Yeah, that's the way to be. That's the way to be. So I sold weed in the dorms in college, and I was like, you know, I'll do pharmacy. I'll make money, then I'll be able to impact the world. That was my mentality. It's like I'll make money, and I'll be able to do something with, good for the world. So I took an English class, and they're like, oh, look at your future career. So I studied. I did a paper on. I sat at a pharmacy on campus and did a research paper. And I'm like, fuck, this is a terrible work. This job sucks. Like, I don't want anything to do with, like, just having to awkwardly force people to talk about, like, the drugs they don't want. Kids getting their STI medications. People are embarrassed. There's all this, like, weird awkwardness in a pharmacy. Like, it's just not, like, nobody's going there, you know, for a doctor to talk or to, like, engage. I just didn't like it. It's, like, a pill mill. And I was, like, also, like, I grew up in an industrial area. I lived 3 miles north of U.S. Steel. I could see a flame from U.S. Steel over a vista over the freeway. I'm just north of 94. I'm on the edge of Southwest, edge of Southwest and the West Side in Dearborn. So it's industrial as fuck over there. So I grew up with asthma. I started getting all these autoimmune diseases. I come to where I get like in high school I started getting eczema. In college, stress. I started getting alopecia. All these autoimmune diseases coming up. I see a holistic doctor and he's like, you're allergic to wheat. So I cut out the wheat. I start getting into my holistic health. That happens in college. I start cooking for myself, you know, getting out the house, not eating shitty, you know, like ramen noodles and these sorts of things that are toxic as fuck. So I'm on this, like, awakening to food. I'm also, like, again, like, seeing pharmacy as a bad place, too. It's, like, all drugs, shitty drugs. So that I'm getting out of that. I started taking political science classes. There is no Latin American studies at Eastern Michigan University, so I was taking political science classes that were looking at Latin America. I come to understand the relationship of the United States to Latin America, which is a neo-colonial relationship. Again, neo-colonial being using finance to extract the wealth, as opposed to occupation.
Around what time? Like, what years is this?
This is my sophomore, junior, and senior year. I was at Eastern 6 years.
So 2000 and what?
I started in 06, so 2008, 9, 10.
So this is like YouTube exists, but it's not like
Yeah.
a deep dive of like
I'm
a
like
lot of
listening
that
to
information.
Immortal Technique, KRS-One.
Okay, okay.
I got my first computer, a shitty little Dell that broke down a bunch. And I started listening to music online, started downloading it illegally, started getting to, the sort of the Afrocentric era of hip hop. And so I was like big into conscious hip hop too, also coming into that world. And I started, I had a professor, Richard Stoller-Shoke. I love this motherfucker. He studied the Zapatistas, and he would go down. And the Zapatistas are an indigenous revolutionary movement in southern Mexico. They actually had an armed revolt against Mexico. So they were like, so there's like there's like a bunch of native groups, and they had like a civil rights movement in the same time as our civil rights movement. Nobody really knows about it, but it's like in southern Mexico for their languages, for their cultures. These motherfuckers get assassinated in Mexico. I mean, these like indigenous land protectors in Latin America straight up get fucking murked. They get like just like Martin Luther King, but like probably on a bigger scale. I'll say there's more assassinations that happen out there. But they do a revolt against NAFTA in 1994, and they have an armed revolutionary movement where they take over the capital of Chiapas, a state in southern Mexico. And now they have like now there's just like a ongoing revolutionary movement. So I go down there. My professor, this professor who studies them, sends me down there. That's a big awakening for me too. It's like understanding like.
And how
the
old are
history.
you at the time?
So I'm like, I think I was like 20 when I went down there.
Wow. So you're 20 in Mexico, seeing revolutionary works. Like, this is real. Like, this isn't because usually as an American, the one person that I know of when I think of Mexican rights that's presented to me is Cesar Chavez, in which I do think, like a Martin Luther King story, even the framework of the story of Cesar Chavez is framed from a lens of an American
he's
conditioning.
a nationalist. He's a nationalist himself too. There's a lot of critiques of him and Dolores Huerta, who's another woman who's in the same movement, the U.S. farm workers movement. He just on the inside tee, people are like, he was like very anti-undocumented immigrants, just on his nationalism shit, which is kind of shady for somebody who works in agriculture. But anyhow, so I was studying that, and like basically these are indigenous corn growing people who, when NAFTA was passed, they had to compete with U.S. subsidized GMO trash shit industrial agriculture corn, and there's no competing with that. Not when it's subsidized to the tune of millions of dollars, billions of dollars.
And let me stop you there. And you know way more about this. So two things. NAFTA, like we just spoke about, NATO was basically like a
North American Free Trade Agreement.
Yes. So basically, instead of like NATO was like, let's block out Russia. NAFTA was like, let's block out anybody that's not connected to our corporations of America. A Bill Clinton thing, good old Clinton administration.
Yeah.
And then we also have to look at right now what's happening, and I'm just learning more game. And a lot of these quote unquote green justice fights are ousting out a lot of farmers across the world under the guise of, now you can't use this and you can't use that, or you can't use this.
There's so many nuances.
That.
Let me get into this a little bit. There's so many nuances to all this. First, I'm gonna back out and I'm gonna like frame globalization and free trade real quick. So, and this relates to Detroit's history. So the history of a Rust Belt northern industrial cities, which also relates to this world history part, this Bretton Woods history. So like after World War II, European factories are bombed out. United States is an industrial powerhouse. That's when my grandpa moves north. That's when the Great Migration is really popping off. Industrial sort of shit, late Industrial Revolution shit in the northern United States. Not Industrial Revolution, but the industrial boom of post-World War II, because they were the main industrial producer. So that is boom. Unions jump off. All of a sudden, everyone's clamoring. Boom. Civil rights movement jumps off. So capitalism, labor, wealth, like these companies say like, okay, they got strong unions up here. They don't got them in the South. So the auto industry and these northern industries began relocating to the South, where there were no unions. And then they're like, okay, boom, we can go to Mexico. We don't got to pay Mexican labor that much, boom. So they move to Mexico. NAFTA comes out. NAFTA and free trade agreements are about freeing capital, which means freeing money to move, but not freeing people to move.
Yeah.
So like, and then globalization is such that we're like, boom, shifting from Mexico to China. And this is what emptied American industry. This is a transition of American economy in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, and 50s being predominantly industrial to being predominantly service sector. And those service sector jobs don't pay.
That, and let's put it like this too. It's funny you bring this critique up. Boy, oh boy, we can talk for hours. In this whole quote-unquote awakening of the information technology age, which is more along the lines of what you said with Bill Gates. But my argument here, and people have heard me use this term, and you all know this one, an economic term, externality, meaning that it was not, externality is basically like this.
Marathon processes oil and pollutes the air, so 4.217 people have high rates of cancer. Their air pollution is a negative externality of the profits of Marathon.
Exactly. Positive externality. We think the industrial movement, hiring labor, was something that Van Buren, Carnegie, and Rockefeller and all these people, J.P. Morgan Chase, wanted to do. No. At the time, for production and what was needed, you need industry for it to produce. So a positive externality is, quote unquote, all these jobs. Yep. It never was the goal of Van Buren, Carnegie, and everything else. Like when we were younger, we're from Michigan, it would look good. We see all these warehouses and having a workforce of like, it meant something for General Motors to be like, we have 5 million workers. Yeah. Nowadays, we see success as like, 4 nerds in a room, and like, we have $20 billion in this system, quote unquote, to be something. It was an externality. Hence, this also goes into education, because a lot of people say, don't you want an education? No, the reason we have an educational system is because those Van Burens, Carnegies, Rockefeller said, we need to take this agricultural worker and make them an industrial worker. Yep. And these people can't read. Specifically, a lot of those white folks couldn't read. And really, a lot of them couldn't work because they needed no need to work, because we got to think about what was happening in America before they
they worked on the farms.
Exactly.
In the 1900s, I think something like 20% of the population worked in agriculture in 1900. And it was much higher previous to that.
Very much so. So it's like, we got to take this agricultural worker and we got to get them to be an industrial worker. Hence, that's why schools, Central, America's first public high school, looks like a factory. It's built like a factory. Bell's running like a factory. It's like you're basically trying to turn this agricultural worker
to be a 40-hour laborer to work at
a
factory.
There we go. I just wanted to get that as an externality, because oftentimes people think like,
That's why they go to school from 7 a.m. to 2, 3 p.m. because it's like getting ready for the 5. When you're an adult, you get to 5 p.m.
Yes.
8 hours a day. I mean, it's built on that model. Absolutely.
And just the externality of like, nobody ever had a goal of keeping these people working. The goal was to get to make capital, to get money. It was never, quote unquote, caring about you and your family. It's just these pockets and these communities were set up from that as a positive externality, but it never really mattered. Your education, your job, even the union itself was really started because they didn't want to work next to black people or brown people. That's why the start of the union, and I support a lot of people that have done great work through the union, but the roots of the union were racism. But
there's the roots of the union where it's a lot of histories in there. Yeah, it's like reducing it to that is like the roots of the union is because laborers didn't have a say at the table for the conditions in which they lived in,
Okay, like the original, but the thing that gathered
Ford,
a lot more.
But Ford, Ford is like, how can I break up worker solidarity? I mean, this is the ruling class is always looking for ways to divide us. The ruling class. Ford is like, I'll bring Arabs in. I'll bring immigrants in. I'll hire black people, and I'll look good. I'll look progressive. I'll look like a quality guy, a diversity guy, before diversity was a thing. But his whole goal was breaking up worker solidarity. But that's where like you have like the Wildcat strikes and the Dodge Revolutionary Union movement and all of these like black trade unionists who had to operate outside the union structure to engage in things that the union already, there's definitely a history of like union corruption too. I'm not going to like sit here and pretend that's not a part of history and not a part of things. Like I'm not like that sort of like far left that I would want to like erase that history. But the black folks had to operate outside of it. Yeah. And that's why we have a really, that's why I like the General Baker Institute. phenomenal, cool
Oh, very
institution
much so.
in Detroit.
Very much so.
It's harkening on a really important history. I got a chance to meet General Baker a couple times, and that Revolutionary Union movement is important, and so is like the working class movement important.
Jimmy Boggs and American
Gracely,
Revolutionaries.
yeah,
I mean, we gotta. Yes, it does like in it, but we have to understand the roots. Just like I'm still in America, we gotta understand that a lot of the roots of a lot of this stuff, if this was law, comes from the poisonous tree. You know what I'm saying?
Absolutely.
If this was a legal a legal debate, as they say, it's like roots of the poisonous tree. I mean, a lot of stuff here is roots of the poisonous tree.
Oh, of course. I mean, there can be nothing good here that's not rooted because it's on stolen native land. The whole thing is poison.
Yes.
That's why I cheer on the decline of this place. It's like, okay.
Yeah.
You need to bring Trump back.
Hey.
Hasten the decline of the United States because that'll be better for the world.
Hilarious.
I don't know. I've like, my humor's dark because my analysis is deep. And yeah, man, like we are headed for dark times, man. World War III is upon us. We're in it now, man. It's crazy.
I think we are, and
we really are. And like,
I'm definitely gonna bring you back to even talk. I'd love to get you and Russ together on this, and probably Theo Pratt or something. But and carry on with some of this. I do got to ask artistry because
Charles Simmons would be another good one because he's an anti-imperialist to the core and has a good analysis.
It's definitely long overdue to get Baba Simmons here.
Yeah.
How did artistry? Because when we met first, that's how I was introduced to you.
Yeah.
I looked up and I'm seeing, and this is what's so weird. Like right now, it's like and people make like anything an industrial complex, but it's like a mural industrial complex of America.
Yeah.
But I saw you as one of the first people like painting into a mural when it was more rare.
Yeah.
It's almost hard to go back in time to think that it was a time where it wasn't a mural like every block in Detroit.
Yeah.
But
and I couldn't get with the foundation funded bit of things, like man, like this is another part of the neoliberal era is things that the government should be doing, things that are for the public good, things that are thinking about the broader community are done by foundations and nonprofits.
Yeah.
And the nonprofit industrial complex and the foundation philanthropy complex are outgrowths of that in the 40s, 50s, 60s. They said like corporations like didn't engage in social enterprises like that. That's the Ford Foundation wasn't a thing back then. But that limited their ability to influence the way public dollars are spent, the way education money is spent.
The number one thing, hearts and minds. Hearts and minds.
Yeah,
Continue.
absolutely. So like the foundation industrial complex is totally a way for wealthy people to like maintain control. So Detroit, like as Detroit was in decline, it kind of became a graffiti mecca. As there was less funding for the police officers, there were people moving out of the city like crazy. The cops just couldn't control the streets. So artists like myself got big into graffiti. I was like getting big into graffiti as like the transition was happening. And Mike Duggan made that graffiti as part of his campaign. He was like, it is a big thing. He had a whole graffiti task force.
I didn't even know this.
I got prosecuted by the graffiti task force.
Wow,
a lot of people did. Yeah, so
I think I heard Sheefy talk about it one time. Shout out Sheefy.
Yeah.
But I didn't know that you were. I didn't know it was like a task force and all that.
Yeah.
Extra. I didn't even realize that graffiti was quote unquote such a problem in Detroit. But
yeah, it was huge. I mean, like at that, like so, like I'm talking like 2000 and like
13, 14, 15, something.
Yeah,
like
so
that.
that's like bankruptcy time. That's the transition. But like Detroit was like this is like late 90s. Early thousands, like probably thousands. That's when Detroit started becoming like a major mecca for graffiti. Like it was everywhere, like covering all those. It's like as the industry had left, there was a ton of fucking open walls and nobody was guarding and nobody gave a shit
That's
about.
what you mean in these spaces that certain people labeled as ruin porn.
Yeah.
Okay, kind of like Graffiti Alley and things like that. It wasn't like people were tagging the Renaissance Center.
No.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, I mean, people were tagging all sorts of crazy shit in that time frame. I was tagging all sorts of crazy shit. I have the biggest graffiti in Detroit history. A lot of people also don't know this. I was the first one to tag the Douglas Brewster projects.
Wow.
So we tagged the whole face of
do
the
remember
Douglas
that.
Brewster projects.
I
So
do
that was me
remember
and my
that.
boy Ndio. It was 3 of us. We had
How long
5
did
gallon
that take?
buckets. That took like 11 hours. And I had to do it in 3 different sessions, or 2 different sessions, because it started raining like crazy when I got up to I did NSTRS on the side of this brick building. That was featured in the movie Brick Mansions. I'm trying to pull it up for the camera.
Okay.
But yeah, it was like that's a 15-story building that I painted. Me and my buddies all painted each a wall of it. So we cracked that. I did the Columbus statue downtown. I put a axe in the middle of his head. I don't know if you saw that one.
Okay, I did see that one. I thought that was clever. I didn't know who did it, but I thought that was actually. I was like, boy, I love some Detroit.
I did the. Well, this is the Douglas Bruiser projects.
Yeah.
So that's a 15-story building. I had tagged
Wow.
NSTRS on it, which is Spanish for we, which is my graffiti name. I'd also tagged a lot of fists all over the city. I had tagged the word decolonize all over the city too. And this was opposition to the bankruptcy process in Detroit. So that's my awakening. So I had studied economics in college. I had looked at Latin America's role. And I thought, like, damn, like, the IMF and the World Bank structural adjustment agreements are a lot like the sort of agreements that Detroit is under right now. And I got a job for Alliance for Immigration Rights. Now they're like Michigan United. Not a big super fan of the old executive director. I like the new guy, Ken, is pretty cool. But I was a democracy fellow trying to get out the vote in 2012. When we had a bankruptcy emergency manager taking over our city, and our democracy didn't mean shit. So I was like, man, like, how is it that I'm in a nonprofit organization trying to mobilize my community to vote when their vote doesn't mean shit? And the bank and the emergency managers here making all these rules, privatizing everything, selling everything off. That's why, like, we went from Cobo to Hall to, like, whatever fucking bank it's now called, because that's a settlement, a part of the emergency financial management process. So I was tagging fists in opposition to the emergency management sort of law stuff.
I've seen those fists.
I was also I did this Malcolm X in my neighborhood. I was doing projects like covering blight with graffiti. And like, for me, like, it was like, how can I get my community to be reflected in the walls? How can I get our stories, our heroes, our ideas up on walls? How can I get revolutionary ideas on walls?
This is before the mural movement. That's
how can I get resistance on the walls? How can I get radical ideas? We're subjected to billboards all the fucking time. We got to look at messaging from Marlboro. We got to look at messaging from, like, sex pills. We got to look at messaging from, like, whatever. And, like, how is it that I could put up my messaging and my ideas that are radical and beautiful and reflecting our story, our ancestry, our history? And that was, like, why, you know, like, I got into, like, muralism.
That's deep.
And then it became, like, a fucking toy thing for, like, posh new restaurants and parking structures and shit like that. And I couldn't keep up with it because I hated all the capitalists who were taking everything over. I hated the idea that, like, Dan Gilbert was funding murals. I did that Zombieland in downtown. Did you ever peep that joint? That was on the that's this one. This was also from the Brick Mansions movie.
Okay, I have seen that.
And that's downtown on the a building downtown. So I tagged Zombieland on that building, and that's because of I had a homie. Loaf was his name. He's a legendary graffiti artist from Southwest Detroit, and the history of how Lil Caesar's Arena came to be is the Illiches. So, like, you don't know the if people who are watching this who aren't familiar with Detroit, just north of downtown is the Cass Corridor, and it's like this stretch of land between Wayne State University and Midtown and downtown.
Like the Fox Theater, basically.
Yeah, there's Tiger Stadium there. A bunch of stadiums have all moved into that area. So that's prime fucking real estate. And in the 80s, 90s, and early thousands, up until 2012, that was a slum. The southern part of Cass Corridor was intentionally slummed out because it was purchased through private companies. Nobody knew who was purchasing them. And it was the Illiches. The Illiches made it a place where you could get sex and drugs, and it was just a shitty little ghetto part of downtown. That's because they were always looking to build this stadium. 20 or 30 years ago, they intentionally slummed out that area. So my boy Loaf, we were talking about doing graph over there. And he's like, man, that's fucking zombie. That's zombie land over there, man. All them, like, crackheads and all those, like, because there's, like, at the time, there was, like, an addiction counseling place. There's a bunch of halfway houses. And it's just, like, a lot of shitty, unkempt residences. You know, we're talking bed bugs. We're talking all that. And that's owned by the Illiches who are secretly buying it. So when the emergency manager gets into town, a financial dictator, they negotiate directly with that motherfucker to buy all the land for nothing.
Mm-hmm.
The rest of the land that they hadn't bought for nothing. And that's why I love that house that one house that stood up
And
and
that guy.
didn't sell out until somebody mysteriously burned it down. You know what I'm saying? Like, these capitalists, these wealthy, rich elites are just trash human beings. And, like, you could negotiate and do pay more and work out a deal with the city and get a community benefits package that benefits everybody. Instead, he waited to negotiate directly with the emergency manager, and our future education dollars went to pay for that stupid
Tax
stadium.
capture, yeah. It's sad. It's sad.
It's insane.
With that, we're going to wrap today. But we definitely bring you back. It's gonna be more, as y'all see. Me and Antonio, it's like we bouncing stuff back. It's tough to meet somebody with the layers of like the economy, history, world politics, and then also the D. You know what I'm saying? But it all like flows. It's fluid, and then also hip hop through graffiti and other stuff too. So it's definitely always different to have one of these discussions. It's rich. If people want to get in contact with you, how they reach out?
Yeah, I've been like terrible at marketing and branding myself. I've done like lectures at like
Everywhere.
all over the place, like Europe and fucking MIT and Yale and shit like that. It's like, but I haven't had a place to. I'm getting a website together. It'll be like related to my name, Antonio Rafael. I think. I'm like gonna get an LLC popping, but you could just check me on the social medias. SW Detroit Jesus is my Instagram. Antonio Rafael on Facebook. But yeah, I'll have a website and all that in the coming months. I'm trying to finally like get rid of that. Yeah,
get some of this stuff in his head. He needs to get it out. As you see, it's like I'm getting it out all the time.
Yeah, I need to get it out,
especially with these information. So you don't be surprised. Y'all already know this man is gonna be on Detroit is different pretty
Google
soon.
Me,
So we gonna do it.
Google me. Check out the Sugar Bush Project. That's a project I run. We tap maple trees. I'm part of a group called Black to the Land Coalition. Check us out. We do a lot of work in regards to connecting with nature. So yeah, Black to the Land Coalition. We got a website for that. That's a great organization that I helped co-found. Really love that work. Yeah, those are places you find me in the work.
That works. Thank you so much, sir. Peace and more to come.
Black revolutionaries, distillery owners, Italian fashion retailers, and Motown Grammy winners all share their best stories never before told in any other media outlets on Detroit is Different. Visit DetroitisDifferent.com or download the Detroit is Different app on Apple's App Store or Google's Play Store.